Welcome to Tough Talk. I'm your host, Paul Taros, and today my guest is John Mozena, former Vice President of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and an activist opposed to corporate welfare. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Paul.
So could you explain what corporate welfare and crony capitalism are?
There's a lot of different forms these take, everything from big industry-wide subsidies to small like individual deals. Here at the state and local level, the biggest problem in my mind, it comes in the form often of economic development policy. When a business gets some sort of deal, whether it's a free loan or tax credits or basically just free money from state and local governments to do business. We see it all the time with, oh, so-and-so is building a new plant and it's being supported by the Michigan Economic Development Corporation or the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. And it's basically the idea that if it weren't for this essentially taxpayer support of these businesses, they wouldn't be doing this business, they wouldn't be creating jobs. And that's part of the problem, is there's some really good questions to be asked about whether or not that's true.
Okay. So you touched on it. Tell our viewers what the MEDC and the Strategic Fund do.
Sure. The Michigan Economic Development Corporation, the MEDC, they've got a variety of roles. They are sort of, as the name supposes, the state's engine, the state's group for developing the economy. And again, there's legitimate philosophical questions to be had about how much of a role the state government should have in trying to actually develop the economy as opposed to letting the free market work. But they operate a variety of things. They run the Pure Michigan ad campaigns, for instance. That's their baby. They do grants and programs. They're involved in talent training. When you see pictures of the governor and business leaders over in Japan or China talking to people trying to bring business here, that's often an MEDC thing. And for various reasons, they're partially a state agency and partially a corporate, sort of nonprofit corporate entity, so that we run into often some issues with transparency with them about their ability and willingness to be open in how they work, and it lets them not be as transparent often as a true state agency would be. We see that not just there. There's a reason that there's a corporation in Detroit that does those and not a pure city agency. And then the Michigan Strategic Fund is really the primary funding engine for a lot of these. The Strategic Fund gets money not necessarily from the legislature saying, here's your budget for this year, but rather one of the big ways they get money is they get a piece of the money, $50, $60 million a year or so, from agreements the state has with the Indian casinos around the state. So there's a set fee piece of the gaming revenue from craps tables, slot machines, keno, whatever at these casinos that goes into the state and funds the Michigan Strategic Fund, and that they can then turn around and hand out to the deals that they're making around the state. So they're insulated to a great extent from having to go to the legislature and say, hey, this is how much money we should have because here's the proof that we're actually doing a good job. I mean, there's some of that, but there's a lot of money that comes in just every year, sort of no matter what they do.
Okay. Now, you touched on it before. There's a problem with transparency at times, and it's very difficult for some people to be able to see who's getting it and how much they're getting. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's there's a real problem with the idea that when a company is getting, either the ability not to pay as much tax as their competitors, or maybe actually even getting money back from the state if something is called a refundable tax credit, which basically means if you owe, say, $1 million in taxes and you've got a $2 million refundable tax credit, you're getting $1 million, you're not only not paying your first $1 million of taxes, you're actually getting $1 million check from the state. It's a way of basically handing out money without actually writing someone a check. It's called a tax credit as opposed to we're sending you free money. But yeah, they will say that, oh, well, that who actually is sitting on these these refundable tax credits is is private taxpayer information that these major corporations, and we sort of assume that many of them are like major automakers and tier 1 suppliers and other major corporations, because they're the ones who have enough in taxes to need that size tax credit, that the fact that they're going to be allowed at some point to not pay taxes is private information and not something that should be public for all the other taxpayers to look at and have a say in whether or not that's a good idea. I personally don't think that's a good idea, but unfortunately so far there's been a real lack of effort on that. And then again, like I said, because it's a corporation, the degree to which you can get into the inner workings, that you can use Freedom of Information, Open Meetings Act. They've had a long problem with hiring a company that basically exists to come up with really positive reports for economic development companies across the groups across the nation, as the one of saying like, oh, well, for every dollar we put into this, we make back some insane figure that if that were true, then why don't we spend more on it? Because if we're getting that much money back, this is the best investment ever in the history of mankind, just about. So yeah, I mean, it's a real problem beyond just the pure the difficulty of knowing who's doing what with what money and who's benefiting at the cost of whether it's the taxpayers or the competitors or whoever. You know, just the very act of not truly sort of opening up their books to the world at large and saying, okay, researchers, college professors, critics, here's the numbers, have at them. If they truly believed they were as good at this stuff as they say they are, they should have no problem showing the books like any other government program would.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the epic failures by the MEDC?
Well, if we wanted to list their epic failures, we'd have to make this not a one-off interview. It'd have to be like a Ken Burns mini-series. But it's almost easier to say, like, where did they work right? I mean, by some metrics, like a third of their deals either fail outright or they had to go back and amend them in some way to like, you know, lower down the expectations, which, you know, if this were a venture capital firm, if this were a bank, they'd be out of business. You can't have a third of your deals go wrong and stay in business unless you're a government entity like this are. A good example of the kind of thing where it sort of shows the futility of what they're trying to do is the company Adient that was a spun-off from Johnson Controls, the big auto supplier. They're a seating company, and with all this huge hullabaloo a little while ago, it was announced that they're going to come down to Detroit, put their headquarters in the city of Detroit in this historic building. They were going to renovate the whole building. It was going to be 200-something jobs, like 215 jobs created in the city of Detroit. They were going to invest over $200 million in private equity, and the MEDC was throwing in $2 million, and I think the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation was throwing in some money as well. Well, just recently, the company's been not doing terribly well, ups and downs of the industry. They brought in a new CEO, and they said, oh, you know, it turns out we're not going to be coming to downtown Detroit. Like the way business is going for us, we can't justify that expense. We're going to stay out in the suburb where we are in our sort of simple, sort of normal, boring office building, and never mind. And so, you know, they never took the money from the MEDC, but at the same time, it really shows the degree to which companies make these decisions based on how business is going. You know, you put a store where you think customers are going to be. You build a plant if you think you've got customers for what it makes, and if you think you can have workers there and good transportation system and all the other things. There's an entire industry of site planners that help corporations make the smartest decision about what they're going to do with their money when it comes to building stuff and expanding or buying things. And some research recently out of the Upjohn Institute in Kalamazoo, a really very well-respected, non-political, nonpartisan group. They went through and did some research and said at least 3/4 of the time, and arguably up to 98% of the time, these corporations that are getting incentives, getting some sort of special deal from the government, would have made this exact decision. They would have built the same building, renovated the same thing, expanded the same plant without these deals. So because they're doing it because it makes sense for their business, they think. But they're taking the free money anyways because why not? So they're like, hey, the business people are like, this is great. We get free money. Everybody likes free money. The politicians who are handing the money to these guys love it because they get to sit there in the photos with the hard hats and the silver shovels and take credit for creating jobs. And the rest of us who are paying taxes, the competitor down the road who didn't get the free money, I mean, we're kind of screwed, but we don't matter. So.
Now, do you ever see any correlation between companies that get these tax breaks and these companies contributing to the various political campaigns?
I mean, that certainly does exist. I think that's probably less common than people expect, especially at the local level where, if you're a city council member or whatever, that those aren't exactly super expensive campaigns. The benefit is less in, that certainly does happen. It's more often that what it is the company putting its own resources into talking up the politician and making the politician look good for the constituents. Because, at the end of the day, the first thing any politician wants is to be reelected. That's their primary goal in life, is to stay in power. And the more that they can be given sort of in-kind time on a stage with a microphone by the company, and the company can make sure that they're in front of the workers and that their photo is on the stuff, that's almost more value often to a politician than a 100 or 2. That certainly does happen. It's rarely that sort of you vote yes and I'll write a check, quid pro quo. At least at the state and local level, it does happen more. But you talked about the strategic fund. They have, I think this is a good example of the kind of swamp of interests here. They have a board that is largely nominated by the governor, approved by the Senate, of people who make the decisions as to who gets these deals at the state level, who gets state strategic fund money. I went back and looked through their meeting minutes a little while ago, and since August of 2015, which is as far back as I could stomach going right now, they have, and they're handing out, like I said, $50–60 million a year. They have not had a single new deal come up to a vote of the board that even one person voted against. Not that these deals got voted down, but even one person was in opposition. There was one time back, I think in maybe April of 16, I'm not sure exactly when it was, when a request for an additional investment into an existing deal that was already getting MEDC money, I think had 2 votes against it. It was apparently something complex in Grand Rapids, and I don't know the full story, but any legislative body, any nonprofit board, any bank, any venture capital firm, anybody who's doing deals with anybody's money, for there to be no public dissension, nobody publicly thinks, I don't think this is the best idea, I'm going to vote against this one. I'll vote against all the other ones, but I'm going to vote against this one. For that not to happen over the space of 3 years, that shows that all the work's getting done behind the scenes. You asked about transparency, that's it. It shows that this board really isn't working in any meaningful way as the representatives of the people. That's what a public board is supposed to be. They're supposed to represent our interests. Well, if nobody ever thinks that any of these deals are a bad idea, and 1/3 of them are going south in some way, shape, or form, then we should probably find some different board members. And then when you look more at the board, you see that, well, the reason they're not doing that is because these are, by and large, people who are in this industry. It's a number of them who have to recuse themselves from this vote or that vote because they do business with one of the companies under involvement. It is just very much being run sort of by and for the companies, the politicians, the couple hundred people who work for the MEDC and make a very good living off of this and have no incentive to not hand out the money because it's not their money and nobody's holding them accountable for failing at it. And meanwhile, like I said, the taxpayers and the entrepreneurs who are trying to compete against these big businesses, and even the big businesses on the street who aren't getting these deals, are getting screwed.
Okay. How do you respond to people who say that naturally these tax breaks are going to the large corporations or very wealthy individuals because they're the only ones who can do these projects and create these jobs?
Well, I would respond that if you look at the statistics nationwide, most job creation doesn't happen in big business. It happens in small businesses and small, medium-sized businesses. When you hear of big businesses, it's not that they're hiring thousands, it's usually that they're laying off thousands, by and large. I mean, there's certainly at the times when that's different, but for the most part, job growth happens smaller, growing businesses as they're going from startups to small business to medium business and then hopefully to large business over time. Another response is simply that if they've got a good business plan, if there's actually a good business reason behind them doing this, there are a lot of people out there who will happily loan them money to go make a profit. I mean, they're called bankers. I mean, that's what they do. There's whole industries of people, venture capitalists and bankers, and Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street as an engine, exists to give money to people with provably good ideas to let them make a profit so that Wall Street can then take a share of that profit. So if these are like legitimate business plans with legitimate corporations, a legitimate chance for success, they don't need our help. And if they're not, they shouldn't get our help because they're not making a good decision.
Okay. Now, State Representative Stephen Johnson submitted his stance on corporate welfare in a statement to Michigan Capital Confidential. I'm going to read what he wrote, and I want to get your thoughts on it. I would be happy to work with Pfizer, Amazon, Quicken Loans, or any other big corporation to lower taxes for all businesses in Michigan. But I am unwilling to subsidize a select few privileged businesses, regardless of whether it is in my district or on the other side of the state. We should have a business climate that is appealing to all businesses, and we should encourage business growth in our districts by lowering taxes across the board in the state of Michigan for everybody. Studies show that Michigan could drastically cut the state business tax and the state income tax if we didn't subsidize these large corporations off the backs of everybody else. For these and many other reasons, I am opposed to corporate welfare and would like to see a level playing field for all.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a very principled point of view, the idea that, and it makes the point of economic development. I mean, if you actually think about the two words, economic development, when you're handing out a $100 million or whatever to one company, is that developing the economy or is that helping that one company make a profit? Because, as he said, you can cut everybody's taxes. You could create a much more amenable environment for the economy to develop by making it easier for everyone. In fact, some research within the past few months by the Mercatus Institute at George Mason University excuse me, estimated that Michigan could actually eliminate its business tax altogether if we just didn't, basically if we just sort of closed the doors at the MEDC and the Strategic Fund and the associated local and county level authorities. Just if we stopped the amount of money that we give out to a few select companies would be equal or more than the amount of money we get in taxes, in business taxes. I mean, obviously they pay sales tax, they pay other taxes. Or we could cut our personal income tax for families, 10%. Or we could cut the sales tax would have challenges because that's how we fund education primarily. But there's any number of things that we could do, like I said, to make a good environment for everyone, to make us attractive for everyone. Because who's to say that an Adient or an Amazon or Quicken Loans that they are more worthy of support than the person who's going to come up with the next Adient or Amazon or Quicken Loans. I mean, Jeff Bezos, richest man in the world, head of Amazon, he started off as a tiny little company. And at the time that he was starting up Amazon, the Walmarts and Myers and Sears and everybody else of the world, these retailers that he was going to have this massive effect on, were getting these corporate welfare deals to help grow the economy. Meanwhile, this guy who created all these jobs eventually, who's famously his first desk was a door on two sawhorses, he wasn't getting any help from anybody along those lines. So I personally would rather live in a state that treats every business fairly, that is welcoming to business, that is a place where entrepreneurs can flourish and succeed and try new things and hire people and develop an economy, way more so than I'd like to live in a state where a few big businesses with political connections and the money to bend the ears of the politicians and bureaucrats in Lansing are the ones that get all the money and everybody else pays the taxes that support them. I mean, this is an area where, again, I'm a free market guy, but I can talk to a Bernie Sanders supporter on stuff like this and agree with them largely. I talked to a socialist, an actual honest-to-goodness socialist professor who said, well, you like the idea of government, sort of fixing the problems of the free market. He's like, oh, no, this is socialism for rich people. I'm like, oh, okay, that's a good way of putting it. It's very true. It's the government control of economy, but it's only benefiting the guys who are already wealthy. There are good arguments to be made that this increases inequality. Now, you can not think that inequality is necessarily always a bad thing and still think this is a really bad way of creating more inequality because the big businesses benefit while the small businesses pay for it. But this is money that comes out of usually local services. This is the kind of stuff, property taxes, these sorts of things. So this is money that isn't going to police, fire, roads, schools, trash pickup, all of these things that we all benefit from as communities. I mean, we can argue about how much we should be spending on those things and what the right funding mechanism is, but I think we can all agree that if it's $1 going to some rich dude or some massive corporation shareholders or money going to, fuel up the fire trucks in our community, which we'd rather have it go to.
Right. Well, I'm a CPA, and I have a lot of small businesses as clients. And every time Dan Gilbert gets hundreds of millions of dollars, they always ask me, where's my check? Give me $100 million, and I'll create X number of jobs.
Yeah.
So it really does seem unfair, and I think that Stephen Johnson is on the right track. Let's have a level playing field for all.
Absolutely, and the challenge is, and I firmly believe that he means that. Unfortunately, Governor Rick Snyder, when he was, I can't remember when he was campaigning or first came to office, he was opposed to this stuff. He called it the heroin drip of government. These kinds of deals. And the problem is he got to Lansing, and over time people bent his ear, and he wanted to be in the photos and all those things, and he ended up in his sort of this last year or so supporting all of the legislation to create these new deals where, like now, developers like Dan Gilbert, they're not just getting property tax incentives, they're actually collecting a piece of the income tax that the construction workers building their buildings should be paying to the state. And then once the building is built, if their employees are there, they're getting a piece of the income tax that their employees should be paying to the state. I mean, that's a new thing that just happened within the past year and a half or so.
And that's the good jobs bill.
That's the brownfield bills there, and it's really, if there's anything that should show the degree to which these programs benefit a few people who already have resources and not everyone, that should be plenty for people to look at.
Okay. Are there any other epic fails that?
Again, there's so many, and I hesitate to pick on too many because I haven't spent a whole bunch of time at the granular level looking exactly at the various programs to be able to sort of poke at people directly. There were on some broader levels, the efforts by the state, and it's one thing when you're sort of just handing money out to the folks who show up asking for it. When the state makes an effort to sort of focus this economic development stuff at a particular industry that's politically favored under the Granholm administration, the battery plants, A1, 2, 3. Well, I guess that didn't work out so well. The solar plants, again. It's just, they're bankrupt, they got bought out, they failed, the markets weren't there. And then there's a good example, there's a company, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, I just came out the other day where a subsidiary of a Spanish company that's been around for something like 400 years or something ridiculous like that, it's this old defense contractor, announced that they're getting state money and local money to put their headquarters in, I believe it was Shelby Township, somewhere in Macomb County in that defense corridor they've got. And there's all this thing of like, well, they were attracted here by all the subsidies and the incentives and everything else. And they're a company that makes, again, from memory, like parts for automotive applications in the defense sector. So stuff that goes into like the cars and trucks the military buys. The reason their headquarters is in Macomb County is because that's where the customer is. That's where the Tardak and TACOM at the Detroit Arsenal there in Warren, like that, the people who buy their products are there. And so there's all this work that goes into the county and the state level saying, oh, well, we're promoting our defense sector and we're promoting all this and all these incentives are necessary to get these companies to come here. They're there because their customers are. It's like saying, well, we got these, we got the auto suppliers to put their parts here. Well, the folks the auto suppliers are selling their parts to, like, are in Detroit. They'd be like, saying that, if you were selling surfboards, oh, you did a great job by attracting them to like Hawaii or Venice Beach and not Nebraska or something like that. It's that kind of mindset where they're making these decisions because it's the right business decision to make, which good for them. And I hope all these companies are successful, but they can do it on their own, or they can convince somebody else who can actually look at their business plan. Yeah, we got a good business plan here, and then let them loan them the money, not me.
Okay. So what are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on starting up an organization to sort of take this on a little bit across the nation. This is an underappreciated massive thing when you add it all up. But by some estimates, you're looking at $75 billion a year across the nation every year in these deals handed out. That would be the third largest federal agency if you added that all up. It's bigger than the state budgets of most states. You could run Michigan for a year on that and throw in like South Dakota and New Hampshire or something like that. It's real money and very few people are paying attention to it, not enough. And then not enough Americans realize sort of what we've been talking about they take for granted the idea that this is job creation and economic development, and they don't really realize the costs to their businesses, their communities, just sort of the general fairness and health of the political climate and the economic climate in their communities. So working with some folks, I've been talking to a lot of people across the country on the idea of a group sort of from a free market point of view, but open to talking to, like I said, everybody across the political spectrum on, let's maybe see if we can't at least get some more transparency in this, and if not, maybe start dialing it back a little bit and before everybody starts throwing $7 billion at Amazon for their next headquarters or whatever it is.
Well, it's certainly a very important topic, and I applaud you for trying to bring attention to this issue, and I wish you best of luck.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John.